Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Black Tie Affair. I am your host, Joseph, and today I'm going to be bringing you something a little different. I'm going to be doing a series on Warhammer Total War, but more specifically, Warhammer Total War lore. So if you're looking for a full playthrough, I will have a full playthrough with commentary and a separate playlist, and I hope that I can see you guys there. But for now, let's get right into Dwarven lore. Now, I picked the Dwarves to do lore on first because they're perhaps one of the most interesting races in the Warhammer world. They're most certainly one of the oldest, and perhaps are one of the most powerful, both technologically and in the amount of manpower that they can muster at any one point in time, both in experience, the numbers, and relative power. And by that I mean physical power, not magical. So let's get right into it and describe to you what is a dwarf. Well, dwarves are short, normally coming up to about the midriff of your average human, so that puts them at about 3.5 to 4 feet tall. They are very broad and very heavy, meaning that although they are shorter than most humans, they generally weigh more. Now, we always have that picture of dwarves being very obese and being kind of the loud drunkards, but this is not true for the majority of the dwarves of the Warhammer world. Now, they might have little bellies, but that's simply because they don't do much cardio. Kind of hard to do cardio when you live underground. I was going to start with a little bit of their history, move to their culture, and then go back to their history. And I feel like this is a very important way of doing things, mostly because Dwarven history has 3 major points in time that changed dwarves forever. But before that, they were basically human beings, and this is what I was talking about, doing a little bit of prehistory. Before the great first change in Dwarven society, they were basically humans. They lived in a Stone Age society, and the majority of them spent their time hunting and gathering. Eventually, they were able to learn the ways of smithing, such as bronze making and iron making, but it was then that the first major change happened to the dwarves, and this was the coming of chaos, the first great incursion of the ruinous powers. Now, this caused a major shift in their society, mostly because, of course, the ruinous powers, being those of the Immaterium and pretty much pure evil, made it so that the dwarves must become a militaristic society. If they were not, they would have been wiped out by all of the horrible demons that spewed forth from both the North and the South Pole. And this caused an extreme change in their society. No longer were dwarves able to break away from each other. They were very much 100% a race united against a common foe. If you were to leave your homes, or if you were to try and travel, more likely than not, you would be killed. This is also the first time that the Book of Grudges began to be used, and this will be a hallmark in Dwarven culture when we get to that section, which is coming up fairly soon. But needless to say, with the coming of chaos, all things for the dwarves changed. They began a religious practice, which was the worship of their ancestors, and they also became a very traditional society based on their need for military. Almost all Dwarven men and most Dwarven women were pressed into the military forces and were used as kind of a bulwark against terror, if I can quote some Warhammer 40k. This was also the first time that the dwarves came in contact with the High Elves. At this point, they were known only as the Elves, but they were High Elves, just to keep everything a little bit cleaner. They were able to start up a trade network, and this is really where Dwarven society matured and began to become created. And this is where I think it is probably the most important part for the Total War series, to know what a dwarf is and why you stand where you do. Dwarven society is a extremely traditional one, of course. I've mentioned this before, but it is. The main ruler of the Dwarven kingdoms is known as the Dwarven High King, and below him are the lesser kings, also just known as dwarf kings, who each normally rule a stronghold, or in sometimes a mine, an outpost. As long as they rule something, they're technically a king. And whether or not this means that you rule over a bar well, then you might just be considered a king. However, those kings normally capitulate to even greater kings, to even greater kings, to even greater kings, until later you get the High King. And he technically has complete authority over all the dwarves. However, he normally has to go through many, many mandates and long years of legislation in order to get anything done. The current High King is, of course, the faction leader and faction lord that we see here in Total War, Fogrim Grudgebearer, on his great chair. This is actually a position of honor, and I'll get to that once we get into the royal clans. However, each dwarf king does have pretty much absolute authority over his own karak, and this is really where the dwarven High King has trouble. Because if he has absolute authority over the dwarves and the lesser kings have absolute authority over their holds, he has to ask the dwarven leader of that hold, or karak as it's called, in order to do pretty much anything in the hopes that he doesn't inspire a grudge. Now, I've mentioned the Great Book of Grudges, and you probably have been playing Total War for a little while. It's been out for a week or so at the point of this recording, just because I wanted to fiddle with it too. But the Book of Grudges is an outstanding hallmark of the campaign. If you have too many grudges, your people will grow angry. And if you're not constantly resolving grudges, and sometimes even making new ones, your people will get a little angry. So this is basically the Dwarf I Owe You One book. It was started during the Great Incursion of Chaos, at least that's when we believe it was, and has had many, many, many books within the same book. In fact, there's an entire library of the Book of Grudges. The most recent one is the one carried by the High King, and that's the one that he pens in, often using his own blood. Now, the dwarves are exceptionally loyal to one each other and to any race that they deem as worthy, whether through some ancient rite, oath, or even just long-standing healthy relationships. The dwarves currently hold the humans in a pact of brotherhood, thus making it very easy for us during the campaign of Total War to become their friends. And this is due to, again, the incursion of chaos and the war later with the Greenskins. But I'll get into that in the history section. If you are interested, please check out the history section in the next video. Anyways, back to Dwarven culture. The High King commands the lesser kings, and they, in turn, normally control thanes and other types of guilds. A Dwarven thane is basically the warrior leader of the Karak. So they might be extremely wealthy and might be extremely skilled. However, they are generally the Dwarven leader. Now, that is not to say that perhaps a exquisite smith or a barber or somebody who brews the best ale in all of the Karak cannot be a thane. In fact, it's not unheard of. However, generally, when you think of a thane, think of the warrior leader, in the same way that in Total War Warhammer, the thane, I believe, is a Dwarven hero who is a warrior. The runesmith, for instance, could be a thane, same with the engineer, the master engineer. However, just for simplicity's sake, think of thane, think, murder. Murder. Now, what happens when a dwarf edict is challenged? This is very rare, because generally dwarves live for extremely long periods of time, and he has a very, very stoic personality in general. So they're almost never a tyrannical ruler. However, he does have several advisors. These are the Council of Elders. These are made up of thanes and important individuals within the Karak, and they help kind of make sure that things run smoothly. The queen may also sit on the council if the dwarven king is missing, or if she is dead. The queen may often stay on as a elder to teach. Now, this is an important part, because the queen is very important, and wives are very important within dwarven culture. However, women are not usually seen. This might be just due to Games Workshop kind of really impressing on you the image of a dwarf as a short man with a huge beard. However, women are not barred from becoming anything. They can become runesmiths, they could become warriors, they could become master engineers. It does not matter. However, they are generally encouraged, same as in most human societies and the Warhammer world, to stay home and take care of everybody because, frankly speaking, the dwarves are a little misogynistic. During the War of Chaos, this is really where we can see that venerated in the First War, mostly because dwarves were nearly driven to extinction. They had to fight tooth and nail for every single inch, and that meant that they needed a strong support base. And that's where the young dwarves, the female dwarves, and the older dwarves would support most of the most of the fighting force in the male and female fighting dwarves. Now, let's talk a little bit about beards and dwarven religion. I'm going to read a short excerpt here from a wiki page that I found that I thought was exquisite. So here goes. I am a dwarf. My honor is my life, and without it I am nothing. I shall become a slayer. I shall seek redemption in the eyes of my ancestors. I shall become as death to my enemies, until I face he that takes my life and my shame. That is part of the Slayer Oath of the Book of Grimnir. So, who are the dwarven gods, the dwarven ancestor gods, that is? There is Grungi, perhaps one of the most important gods, and is considered the major god, the god of smiths, miners, and the husbands of Valaya. If you look around the campaign mount, I believe you can find the Pillars of Grungi and the Sorrow of Valaya. These are very important parts to the dwarven lore, and when I get to dwarven lore and heroes and locations, I'll explain them more there. Check out that video. Besides that, we have Valaya, the goddess of hearth, home, healing, and protection. She's generally worshipped quite heavily, actually, in dwarven societies, mostly because dwarves live for such a long time that she is often very important, because to bring a new dwarf into the world is such a commitment, because obviously if you live for hundreds of years, your childhood is a very long time, and dwarves would really need to teach you a lot of things over those course of hundreds of years. So Valaya is an extremely important god. And next comes Grimnir, the god of war and the brother of Grungi. Grimnir has played an extremely important role within the dwarven society. At one point, he is believed by many dwarves to have actually been the god that sealed the gates of chaos off for an extremely long period of time, actually going through to the other side into the immaterium and sealing the gates from within. He also was able to throw one of his axes back into the world. And when I talk about dwarven characters and important dwarves, I'll also mention some of the weapons and things that they use, so look forward to that, because the Axe of Grimnir is an extremely powerful weapon. Next, we have some lesser gods. There is Gazul, the lord of undeath and the protector of the dwarf dead. Now, Gazul is a very important god and is sometimes even considered to be the god, depending on the dwarven hold and what's going on, mostly because the dwarves worship their dead. And if they are fighting necromancers or vampires or something like that, they believe that Gazul is the one that will lead them to victory. And as the end times approach, we know that the dwarves seem to be butting up more and more with the undead. There is Mendir, the shaper of ore and the son of Gringi. He's believed to be the most exquisite of all smiths, and perhaps the dwarf that taught, or sorry, not the dwarf, they were all dwarves at one point, I should say. But he is the god that first refined mithril, adamantium, and lothrin, which are the three alloys that you get from the star metal Grimnir. And once again, when I talk about dwarven objects, I'll get into that a little bit more. Then there is Thungini, the god of runesmiths, and the younger brother of Smendir. Perhaps definitely considered a lesser god, mostly because not many dwarves are runesmiths. An incredibly important god, especially on the battlefield, and very important to also the hearth, because a rune of protection might just save a family from a cannonball ruining their homes, or a dwarf or a goblin doom diver smashing through their windows. However, he's only called upon in very desperate points of time or during very sacred rituals performed by runesmiths. And last but not least, there is Morgrim, the god of engineers and the son of Grimnir. It's very interesting that Morgrim is the son of Grimnir, the warrior god, and this tells you a lot about dwarven engineering. Because the warrior god is the son of the god of engineers and pretty much of builders, stone cutters, those types of things, most dwarven cities and buildings are meant as defensive or offensive structures. It's very uncommon that you'll see dwarven buildings built for pure aesthetics. They are normally blocky, because that is simply the best use of space, and very, very strong, with deep foundations and extremely I don't want to say defensible, because some dwarven architecture is exquisitely beautiful and kind of hampers defense a little bit, such as those giant heads we see on dwarven gates that your little dwarves can't shoot over, but very, very practical is the word I'm looking for. They are meant to hold back the enemy and keep the dwarves safe, or destroy the enemy and let the dwarves sally forth, in the case of some dwarven walls, which unfortunately haven't really been done very well by CA, where they have different parapets, different mounts, murder holes, sally forth points, all of these types of gates, different ironworks built into them, so that if goblins or spiders try and call up them, razor wire can be deployed to chop off their limbs, all these types of things. Very, very impressive. But engineers are generally thought of as a part of the warrior culture. They have to go through many, many different things than a warrior, of course, but they are generally thought of as not equals, but very important to any war cause. On that note, let's talk a little bit about the dwarven, I guess we can call it jobs, because the dwarves follow a similar system to ancient medieval times, where they have many guild systems. There's the Armorers Guild, the Weaponsmiths, Artisans, Engineers, Runesmiths, Miners, Metalsmiths, Jewelsmiths, Healers, rada. But for the most part, it's good to know that the Warrior Guild is considered the largest of all the guilds within any of the holds, and are perhaps found in almost every single dwarven community. And that means that the dwarves are definitely a warrior people. They focus mostly on combat. Besides that, the second most popular would probably be the Miners Guild. It is one of the most important parts of any dwarven society, and pretty much all dwarves can do some part of it, especially since they live such long lives, then generally pick one or two things up from their buddies. But in general, there is always at least one miner guild within any settlement. Coming next is perhaps the Brewers Guild. Now, I know what you're saying. How can there go from warriors to miners to brewers? Surely the warriors would need armor, or weapons, or guns from the Engineering Guild. Very, very true. But dwarves need to eat, and the brewer and the farming, and I don't want to call them the Cooks Guild, but the Herder Guild, all those are extremely important because they live underground. They need sustenance, and dwarven brew is perhaps the most, if not alcoholic, nutritious thing within most dwarves' diets. In fact, it's not uncommon for dwarves at war to only take beer with them, because it has so many calories and so many vitamins and minerals in it that they can survive off of it for long periods of time. Now, of course, they do like eating real food, mushrooms, cheeses, breads, meat, all those types of things. But in general, bread and beer is what they take on the march with them. So the Brewers Guild is exceedingly important, and I'm a little disappointed that it doesn't do more within the Total War game for dwarves to keep going. They need sustenance, they need beer, they need food. Next up is, of course, the miners, the metalsmiths and the engineers. Both are incredibly important to support the warrior clan and to just get shit done. You need handles for your doors, you need different things for your wagons, for your guns, all that. Very important. Then, of course, there's the runesmiths, the rune scribers, the jewelers, the weaponsmiths, the armorers, and down the line it goes. But needless to say, those are the important parts, and if you are a dwarf, those are the ways to get yourself to thaindom and perhaps even kinghood. Now it is worth noting that the High King is a hereditary title, but the Dwarven Lesser Kings can be founded. You can become a king if you perhaps find a mineral deposit of Grimnil, which is the star metal that the dwarves use to make their best weapons and armors. Especially if it's you and your family that finds it. You being the leading dwarf of your family, you could declare that you wish to build a karak here and declare yourself as king. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But, it's better than nothing. Now, let's talk a little bit about dwarf-on-dwarf society. The most important thing in dwarven society is your age, then your wealth, then your skill. So an old dwarf with a lot of money that isn't really as skilled as an old dwarf with a lot of skills but no money is kind of more important. The same goes where an old dwarf with a lot of skill and very old isn't really is much better than a young dwarf with a lot of money and no skills. So just in case you're wondering, it's good to be old and very smart. The oldest of the dwarves are known as the Longbeards or Greybeards. A dwarf will never cut or trim his beard. Well, by trim, they do, but in the sense that we think trim. The longer your beard and the more intricate your beard is, it also denotes not only how old you are, but what society you belong to. So an Ironbreaker's beard would probably look very different, to dwarves at least, than somebody who serves in the Engineering Guild's beard. They might have different patterns of runes that they build into it. They might put different pieces of metal, place it over their left or right shoulder. All these different things that kind of denote what society, what clan, what karak, and what you do. It's very, very important to a dwarf. It's basically their way of showing status without having to wear a shirt. Besides that, dwarves also have a very, very rigid and unyielding sense of honor. And this means that, like we said, the Book of Grudges not only contains a lot of grudges between dwarves and other races, but between dwarf to dwarf. Because of this, there's a lot of murders that happen within dwarf society. It may be that your great-great-grandfather believes that he had something stolen by your buddy's great-great-great-grandson. Who knows? But that denotes that you should take revenge when you can. This means that you probably have to kill your friend. Now, dwarves don't always write down such serious messages. Sometimes they'll go to court if they think that they've been wronged, and if they have decades of judicial processes, they go through decades of judicial processes. It's just the way that the world works. Other times, they can decide to perhaps renounce their honor, as to say, and become a slayer. Now, we've seen slayers within the Total War games, and they're an incredibly important part of dwarven society. However, they are very, I don't want to say unrevered, but they are very much looked down upon, in most cases. The Slayer Oath denotes that a dwarf is dead. If your honor has been tarnished in such a way that you cannot reclaim it, such as, let's say, the Greenskins attacked your hold and you are unable to protect it, then you will go to the Slayer Temple, shave your head, and let a mohawk start to grow and dye it red, and you also, or orangish. You also dye your beard, orangish or red. So if you were an old long beard with a beautiful gray mane, it's now like this silly orange color. So everybody can know that you're a slayer. Now, of course, the longer your mohawk, the worse slayer you are, meaning that you've been alive for so long, but also the better warrior. The Slayer's Oath is that he will go out into the world and seek out the foe, whether they be Greenskin, Skaven, who is a race that we haven't seen yet in the Total War series, but I'll talk about later if they don't come out by the time I reach them. The Chaos, even High Elves, they will go out and seek their own death. Now, they can't risk their lives at the... they can't risk their lives in the hopes of dying without helping the other dwarves. So let's say that I'm a dwarf slayer. I see a chaos invasion coming. I'm not allowed to just go run naked at them without any weapons and fight them. I have to take all of my power, everybody that I know, and inform the Dwarven Karak nearest to me what's coming. So I can't just suicide bomb and no apparent reason. I have to fight a valiant death. Now, that's not to say that there aren't slayers that have fought impossible odds, but they must try and help the dwarves as much as possible. That's just the way that it is. Now, the Dwarven Slayer that I will say is perhaps the most important is the Grotrex, or Grotex, depending on how you say it and where you're from. And he's the dwarf that carries the Axe of Grimnir. Very, very important dwarf, and I'll talk about him later. But let's talk a little bit more about Dwarven culture, and then we'll see if we can't wrap this up within the next 30 minutes or so. The dwarves, as I said, are at war with the greenskins pretty much constantly. Chaos, obviously. And now the High Elves. Now this will delve into a little bit of Dwarven history, which I'll cover in the next video. But it's important to note that the dwarves believe that the elves are, if not as bad, maybe even worse than the average greenskin. And talking to an elf, pretty much of no matter what origin, high elf, wood elf, dark elf, pirate elf, snake elf, doesn't matter, is a crime punishable by death, if not exile, or perhaps taking the Slayer Oath. Only if you are making an absolutely most important deal or stealing from the elves are you allowed to chat with them. Such as if a elf wants to buy a simple piece of iron for thousands of dollars, you're kind of allowed to do that because it's considered, ripping off the enemy. Same way as if you are under attack from the hordes of chaos, and it just so happens that there's a small group of elves in the area who also are under attack by the hordes of chaos. A standing treaty will be informed most of the time, and the dwarves and the elves, and perhaps even the humans, will help kick away the hordes of chaos. Now, the humans are perhaps the Empire of Man, the Empire as it's called, is perhaps the most important ally to the dwarves, and definitely they're one of their largest trading partners. Now, again, this will go into Dwarven history a little bit, but needless to say, the first emperor of the Empire of Man, made a brother pact with the High King, saying that if the hordes of chaos or the greenskins ever show up again in such numbers as to destroy either realm, that they'll come to their aid. And for the most part, this is kind of spread throughout the world. Even outside the Empire, if a dwarf is in Bretonnia and the greenskins or hordes of chaos or beastmen are attacking in large numbers, they will help the humans. Mostly because they have a hatred of all things evil, but also because the humans are considered a brother race by most dwarves. Now, dwarves are also completely immune to the touch of magic, so they are a very good fighting force against a lot of chaos and against a lot of the elven magics. This means that they are able to kind of be used as heavy shock infantry when the humans and dwarves fight the hordes of chaos together. The way that I would think of it is that your older, big, heavy brother is really good at getting punched in the face, while you throw magic and fire and attack from the sides. That's kind of the way that the dwarves are used. Incredibly important people to the world. In fact, we're going to talk slightly about the Dwarven economy just because it's so much a part of Dwarven culture. Their main export is, of course, iron, steel, weapons, tools, whether they be wheels made of iron, giant steam engines, those types of things, and also different types of brews and jewelry. The Dwarven clans are well known for having some of the largest treasure holds of any of the races in the world. In fact, their wealth is widely considered to be the largest in the entire world, and that does have some problems for the old dwarves, because when you have a lot, people want it. But they often trade with both the Border Princes, the Empire of Man, Bretonnia, sometimes the Far East and the Far West. There's been occasions very rare occasions, mind you, where they've traded some pieces with the ogres of the Ogre Kingdom, very rarely, but since now that the ogres are becoming more and more mercenary-like, they've seen some dwarven equipment. Now, they will never trade with greenskins, orcs and goblins, or sorry, any greenskins, whether they be trolls, orcs and goblins, snotlings, hobgoblins, or elves. But very, very important. What they get in return is generally foodstuffs, such as venison, beef, just above ground animals. So the way that I would think of it is that the dwarves are basically like Germany. They're sitting there in World War II producing huge amounts of materials, and the empire is either America or Egypt, just producing huge amounts of food to keep them going. Very important that they stay alive. If either of them are destroyed, they will die. I really want to talk about dwarven history, where their economy was shattered, but it's important that we stay on just one topic, I presume. Now, let's talk a little bit about dwarven military works, mostly because we do know that the dwarves are the most technologically improved or forward of everybody else. They have gunpowder, they have helicopters, they have something akin to mechanized warfare, i.e. machine gun cannons, quote unquote, not quite machine gun cannons, but cannons that they can fire in rapid succession. Different layers of mortars and flamethrowers, all these types of things. There's even some designs in some books where dwarves can have multiple crossbows, i.e. a crossbow that can load multiple arrows at a time. And they definitely have the best arms and armor, those being mithril and adamantium. Adamantium and mithril being like 1/5 or 1/10 the weight of steel, but also quite a bit stronger, sometimes even being said to have withstood an entire black orc's might, just a giant black orc smashing this little dwarf with his giant axe and not breaking or crumbling, or letting the axe through to cut the dwarf. Very important. But we do know that they could progress quite a bit farther if they didn't age so long. So let's say that we're in the College of Engineers, right? And I have made up a machine gun. I say, look, this is a machine gun, it's great. The dwarves will take several hundred of years to test it, make new types of it, test those, make new types of those, see how they work over and over and over and over. And that's why the new dwarven flame cannons, the Oregon gun, the dwarf cannon, gyrocopters, gyrobombers, all those things are only being seen now that the end times are pretty much upon them. They could have had submarines, they could have had planes, they most likely could have had machine guns and other such things, but they were held back by their culture. An unfortunate part of life, but that's just the way that things are. In fact, we can still see that the dwarves are very much a traditional-based society, mostly because they still use catapults. Why would you use a catapult when you have a cannon? Well, as it turns out, catapults are pretty good. Especially when you're trying to take a wall and there's enemies on the wall, it's good to have the arc, but that's a war talk, not anything else. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of dwarf holds, and perhaps even the most important of the dwarf holds that we can kind of, take from what we will. There's Karaz al-Karak, which is the most important dwarf hold at this point. It is the seat of the High King and is generally thought to be one of the most defensible Karaks there ever was. The second most important, and at one point the most important dwarven area was Karak 8 Peaks, which we can find within the game. And the reason I'm mentioning these two places is because they're very important to dwarven culture. Karak is a Karak held by the dwarves right now. Karak 8 Peaks was perhaps their greatest of cities that has now been taken over and destroyed by both Chaos and the Greenskins. So this tells you a lot about the resurgence of dwarf kind. At this point, they are trying to reclaim their lost homelands. And again, when I go into their history, I'll tell you more about it. But they are on a constant crusade, I would say, to reclaim their homeland and reclaim their old glories. But if we have any questions about you know, different dwarf cultures or different dwarf society, or perhaps there's something I didn't hit on quite so well, be sure to tell me. And I hope you enjoyed my terrible play of Warhammer Total War in the background. And I will be back probably in the next video talking either about Dwarven heroes, Dwarven history, or Dwarven materials, you know, the things that they use for war. I'll probably combine the two. I don't know how this is going to go. But thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Alright, goodbye.